Hi, nice to see you all here. So let me just introduce Proof News first, where I'm a data editor, because you probably have not heard of it. We are a data-driven investigative journalism studio, and our focus is on holding large tech companies accountable for the consequences of their technologies and their algorithms, with the hopes of inspiring a more privacy-focused, responsible technology sector. So obviously we have a lot of work to do there. But because of this, what we do often more resembles experimental design on the cusp of sort of data science and traditional journalism than it does pure journalism. And that's because the data we need in order to see what technology companies are doing often doesn't exist in the public domain, so we have to generate it or find it. And that's just a little bit of context about how we approach journalism. So the topic I'm addressing today is how we as journalists can cut through the noise in the current information landscape, which is no easy task. The reality is that we all right now are absolutely flooded with content. This is content that may be of high caliber, maybe of low caliber, but regardless, it's often pretty persuasive, it's compelling, and it's attractive, and it's really constant. And this is overwhelming for our consumers, and it's also overwhelming for us when we're trying to distinguish between our work and other forms of storytelling. But in some ways, this isn't really a new problem. Let's consider food for just a minute. So most food used to look like this, right? And now a lot of it looks like that. It was really clear in the old days, what you were getting when you picked up a piece of food. Now, the food on the right here, it's a little different. It looks fun. It's somewhat compelling if you like food that's shaped like a snowman. But regardless, it can be really hard to distinguish sometimes between what you're eating and what's in it, right? So other times, it's much more clear. Right? You can kind of tell that the food on the left here is unprocessed, whereas the food on the right is not necessarily the best thing you could eat. Other times, it's really not so clear what you're getting. We have so many choices every day when we enter a grocery store. We're so inundated with options that it's really often challenging to decide what to eat. And that's really why food labeling came about, so we would know the components of what we were eating and also have some understanding of the process that created it. So at Proof, one of the things we're actually doing now is we're labeling our journalism. We put ingredients labels specifically on all of our journalism. This here that I'm showing you is a project we did to test AI chatbots like ChatGPT, Claude, Llama, Mistral, to see how they would answer questions about voting in advance of the election in November. And what we did is we assembled local officials from around the United States. We brought them to New York. These were all people who were in charge of the voting process in their states. We have a really decentralized voting system in the United States as well. So we invited these folks. We also invited experts in AI, experts in political science, and we had them run prompts through software we built that can query 5 AI models at once. We then had teams of experts fact-check each of the responses and determine if it was accurate, if it was complete, and if it contained harmful content. All in all, as you'll see in our findings, we found that more than half of the model's answers were inaccurate, over a third were harmful, and over a third were incomplete. So if you just read our story, you would get those headlines, but we also provide an ingredients label saying exactly what went into the process of reporting that story. And importantly, we always address what we think the limitations of our work are. What we're trying to do here is be transparent and also convey that a rigorous process went into our conclusions. We're trying to draw the attention to this contrast and signal to readers that a lot goes into creating quality information, and they should know what goes into the media they consume. We also publish a full methodology of many, many pages, detailing things like how we created the prompts, how we defined the testing categories, who did the testing and how, and what other sorts of testing has already been done in the past. It's really long. Obviously, not everyone will read it, but for anyone who wants to know what the story was made of, it's all there. And again, we're sending the signal that we followed a thought-out process and that we want to be transparent about exactly what we did. Okay, so I don't want to be naive here. I'm not saying that putting ingredients labels on every story is some magical way of fixing the media world and its problems. But the idea I do want to emphasize is that journalism is a process. Just like the food we eat is the end product of a process, how it was grown, what was added to it, whether it was pasteurized, fermented, the process or lack of process is really what makes the quality of the food. Not what it just looks like or tastes like. So the process of journalism, similarly, is not the end product. It's actually also just what really defines a story as journalism as opposed to any other type of content. It doesn't need to be written in a certain way, presented in a certain way. It doesn't need to take this perspective of objectivity, but it does need to be the result of a systematic process and a transparent process that tries to best approximate the truth. And so it's this process, the ingredients that matter. Those are what distinguish high-quality food from junk, and they're also what distinguish low-quality information from what we do. And once you have this process and you know what the ingredients are, you can also replicate it and take it to new spaces. So back to this example of AI testing that we did. Once we established this methodology for testing AI models, we took it to creators who have large audiences on YouTube and TikTok, people who have trusting relationships with their audience, who are also experts in their own fields. So these were doctors, geologists, historians, voting rights advocates, and we asked them to use our methodology to test how AI models perform in their own areas of expertise. So we gave them access to our software. We helped them develop the questions they were going to test. And sure, these were not traditional journalists, but they were people who have expertise, and they were able to do it. So these YouTube and TikTok creators did do their own testing. They found their own results. They made videos about what they found for their own audiences, and we also interviewed them about their experience and findings and posted that on our own TikTok and YouTube channels. So this doesn't look like traditional journalism, but it is reaching new audiences who are looking for information, and it's taking this social media environment that's sort of saturated with good and bad information and infusing it with a higher caliber and quality of information. So just to sort of recap, people are already going to YouTube and TikTok for news and information about the world, as we've demonstrated. So this model we're hoping to use is not to like change YouTube or change TikTok and make it full of journalists. Instead, we're really seeking out collaborators who already have an audience and giving them the tools and processes they need to deliver a higher quality of information. So this has been a bit of an experiment for our small little news studio, but overall, for us, it's just sort of a way of conceptualizing a path forward for journalism. And I'll just put my email up there in case anyone wants to get in touch.
Good morning, Rina, and thank you so much for being with us and for this super interesting presentation about your career. Yeah, you spent a decade covering crime in the criminal justice system in the US, which is super interesting, and you're now editor at Proof News, as you mentioned, a nonprofit news studio that collaborates with journalists and researchers to bring together and promote the best practices in evidence gathering. So could you maybe explain a little bit the context and the reasons behind why Proof News was created?
So Proof was really created out of a desire to focus on the analytical and explanatory aspects of journalism. For so long, we've been thinking of journalism as bearing witness to events and then faithfully reporting what we see. But the truth is now the world is flooded and social media is flooded with witnesses to everything. There cannot be a newsworthy event that does not have thousands of people already posting, videos to all kinds of social media platforms. But what these streams and witness-bearing lack is an analytical context and just a sort of assessment of how events fit into the larger environment. So we're both trying to build tools that allow us to be digital witnesses in digital spaces, like uncovering algorithms and understanding how they work, and then also focusing on a more analytical approach to journalism.
It sounds that you value objectivity a lot. So can you tell us what objectivity means for you and how it can help reduce polarization?
So I think traditionally objectivity has really meant sort of this appearance of the lack of bias. And I think, unfortunately, that means that we've sort of defaulted to just covering the loudest mainstream voices on the spectrum. I can't say I believe objectivity exists. I think there are probably more beneficial frameworks for journalists, journalistic ethics.
Okay, and what does that mean for you and kind of some practical examples of things that we can implement in our work, perhaps?
Yeah, I think transparency is a goal of journalism. You cannot be unbiased. You cannot shed all your biases and leave them behind, but you can be transparent about where your facts are coming from, and you can definitely be transparent about what the limitations of your work are. And I think that extends to, I think as journalists, we're always looking, we start maybe with a question and we're looking for the answer, right? A lot of times we don't get there. We were doing a story recently about what is the carbon footprint of a ChatGPT query? Like, how much energy does it take? What are the emissions? And we couldn't find the answer. And I think a lot of times that would be the end of the story, right? But instead, the journey, the process of trying to find that information took us to new things, like why is that information not available? Where are the holes? What's missing? And I think that can be really, that transparency can really guide what we do.
Thank you. Your founder spoke about how journalists have done a bad job of marketing. How can we do better? How can we reach different groups of people? And how would that fight against the polarization we currently have?
I think people don't know what we do. It seems obvious to us how journalism is made, but it's really not obvious to everybody. I recently, a few years ago, went back to school to get a master's in data science, and there were no other journalists there. It was all tech people. And they would ask me things like, oh, is ChatGPT going to replace journalists now that it can write so well? And I didn't realize that that's what people think we do. They think we're writers, that we're just storytellers. But the truth is the most important and creative thing we do is find information, right? We have this amazing creativity in finding new information. And that's something that ChatGPT, by definition, cannot do. It's trained on existing information. So I really think that we do not do a good job of telling the larger public what actually goes into creating journalism and what it's about. And I think that's how we've done a pretty bad job marketing.
Okay, super interesting, thank you. I think we might go to some questions from the public now.
Thank you very much. There we go. Thank you very much for this exchange. So we do have a bit of time for questions from the room if anyone is up for it. So please do make your way to the mics as usual. You know the drill by now. And I'm sure our question asker of the day will certainly have a question for us at some point as well. Props to Rudy. Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your intervention. I had a question about marketing for media. You said that people don't really know how we work, and that could be a way to make it more interesting. But a previous speaker was telling us about how some podcasts, especially very right-wing or even from the masculinist sphere and so on, have really reached out to a very large audience. Do we have to take, are there some things we should take from that and we should use for the more traditional media in order to reach out to a larger audience today? Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's hard to strive for a large audience in this media environment, right? I do think that what we've done, we are a tiny, tiny studio. We have maybe 4 or 5 people working for us. A few of the things we've done to try to reach a larger audience is partner with people who have larger audiences. We partner with creators on TikTok and YouTube to create new information that's of interest to them and of interest to their audiences, but also done in a journalistic way. So that's one way. It doesn't help our brand, but it does help us get better information out there. Another thing we do is we produce content that might be relevant to this creator community. We just did a story about the training data of some big AI companies were using, and they were basically using YouTube videos to train their AI models. That's a very interesting problem for YouTube creators and TikTok creators. They're very concerned about people using their material to basically try to create bots that will replace them. So that got picked up by all kinds of tons of people did their own videos about our story and took it in new directions, and we created a tool that they could use to look up whether their videos had been used in the training data. And so we're trying to take that community seriously as well and report on that community and provide them tools to basically hold tech companies accountable in their own way as well.
Thank you. Please, sir, you had a question. Go ahead.
Must confess that I'm not very good at listening to English that you are speaking, but I take something. My question is, what for the future of the journalism? What do you think about this tremendous evolution of media, social media, facing the practice of the journalism? Thank you.
I think I have a pretty complex relationship with social media. I think it's pretty well documented that social media has had a detrimental impact monetarily on the journalism industry. That said, it's kind of too late now. It's old news. Technology goes where it will. And I think it's just incumbent upon us to continue to pursue the truth and adapt to new technologies, make use of them. And most importantly, I do think one of the big things we can do is a little less focus on politics and a little more focus on private industry and the impact it has in the world, and holding those companies accountable, particularly the tech companies who do control effectively our information space.
Oh. Yeah, please go ahead on that side.
My question flows directly from that about holding the tech platforms and companies accountable. How exactly is Proof News doing that, if you don't mind sharing? Or if, I know you're a small team, but you talked about the content creator side where you're giving them processes and tools, but are you also doing some like larger sort of higher level or macro meta gathering of like what you're learning from these creators' relationships with the information that they're trying to share on those platforms? And are you therefore directly in relation or in communication with the platforms and working with them, or are you trying to put pressure on government? So would love to hear more basically about how you're holding these companies accountable.
So we do not work in collaboration with the tech companies at all. I can tell you a few. So Proof was born out of a different journalism organization called The Markup, where we also worked on some of these algorithmic accountability issues. One of the things we did is we created a panel of Facebook users from across the country, thousands of Facebook users who would send us their Facebook data. So we could see what was happening in different people's feeds, and we could sort of track what the algorithm was doing differently based on if you're a woman, based if you're on a man, like what sort of recommendations it would give you. So that was one of the things we did. We also built a tracker. We built, in partnership with Mozilla, we built a tracker that would send us the data that was going from your browser when you went to a website to Facebook, so we could see exactly what the Facebook pixel, it's called, which is like an implant on various sites, was sending back to Facebook every time you entered information. And we found that it was on hospital websites, so Facebook was getting information about people's illnesses, their private health information. It was on financial application forms, so Facebook was getting information about your finances. So we're trying to be innovative in how we build tools to monitor tech. Because, again, it is not in the public domain. These things are not out there. The tech companies are not going to report this information. We have to be really creative about how we find it.
All yours.
So transparency, obviously incredibly broad, and I think that one of the ways to regain trust is to be transparent about the journalistic process. But not all forms of journalism are very suitable for being transparent. A quick news story, if you're going to slow it down with you know, this is how we got it all, or a YouTube video that needs to be entertaining as well, needs to capture an audience, how do you deal with this this issue of you know, snappiness, entertainment value, while also trying to introduce the transparency that is needed to get the public to trust the news?
I think there are some best practices we can use. I do think it's possible, and even in a quick video, to say, hey, I talked to 40 people and here's 2 of them. Just to convey that you've been out there, you've talked to, you've maybe, or I read 50 articles about this and now I'm talking to these people about XYZ. There's a way to quickly convey that you've done a lot of work in the background before deciding to pick these 3 people to quote. One of my big pet peeves is anonymous sources. I think anonymity is extremely overused, especially in news situations, more breaking daily news situations. It should be reserved for people who are giving important information and have a real threat of harm. Instead, it's being used to quote anonymous opinions, anonymous speculation. It's being used on executives from companies who are talking on background to reporters about the great things they're doing, but will never attach their names to those statements. So I think that, again, would just do a lot in the way of trust and transparency, is to have very strict policies on anonymity.
Okay, please over there. Yeah, final question.
I have 2 very practical questions. First one is like, do you know any equivalent of proof news abroad? And if yes, how do you work with them? And I've been on your Instagram account, you only have around 200 followers. So what can we do to help us to gain more visibility in our daily practice or in terms of social medias?
Yeah, so those are good questions. I don't know of any international equivalents to proof news, but I would love to meet people in this room who are working on similar projects, if anyone is or knows of any. In terms of our own social media presence, it is very small. We are very small. We are a nonprofit. We are not beholden to anyone who's asking us what our numbers are, fortunately. We've deliberately fundraised, telling our funders that that's not our goal, to grow our own audience. Instead, we are using our processes for gathering information and seeking out people who already have large audiences. We're giving them that information, we're helping them produce information, and we're making sure that better content goes into the world. That's not going to benefit our Instagram numbers, it's not going to benefit our Blue Sky numbers, but it does, I think, help us create a better social media environment. And fortunately, we have funders that understand that and are not looking for those more traditional targets.
Rina Palta, thank you again.
Thank you.
And thank you to our students.